Greetings. The question of who the Pelasgians were is one of the most fundamental riddles of classical antiquity. For the ancient Greeks, the Pelasgians were not merely a vanished people, but an integral part of their own self-awareness, a kind of mirror in which they saw their prehistoric past. But who were they? The problem of their identification spans millennia of human development. From the Neolithic settlements of the Balkans to the catastrophe of the Bronze Age and the rise of classical Hellenism, this search has prompted scholars to create numerous theories that have changed in accordance with the development of scientific methods, from the naive etymologies of antiquity to the complex sound laws of modern Indo-European studies and the stratigraphic analyses of archaeology. And it is precisely these theories that we will discuss today. In the earliest epic sources, particularly in the poems of Homer, the Pelasgians appear as a very concrete tribe, endowed with distinct geographic and social attributes. In the Iliad, Homer mentions them as allies of the Trojans, who arrived from fertile Larissa, located in the northwestern part of Asia Minor. Thus, he wrote, "Hippothous led the tribes of Pelasgian spearmen, those who dwelt in fertile Larissa. Hippothous led them with Peleus, sprout of Ares, sons of Lethus the Pelasgian, son of Teutomus." This passage is found in that very part of Book 2 where the forces that came to the aid of Troy are listed, and this distinguishes them from the Pelasgians of Achilles, who are mentioned in Thessaly on the side of the Greeks. Since these Pelasgians fight for Troy, most researchers, including Strabo later on, localized Larissa precisely in Asia Minor, in Aeolus, not far from Troy itself, and not in Thessaly. Although the identity of the names of the cities often caused confusion even in antiquity. The Homeric description of the Pelasgians as divine testifies to the high status of this people in the heroic tradition, where they are viewed not as wild barbarians, but as respected participants in the events of the war. Of special significance is the mention in the Odyssey, where the Pelasgians are listed among the 5 peoples inhabiting Crete. There is a land called Crete, in the middle of the wine-blue water, a handsome country and fertile, washed around, and the people in it are many, past counting, and there are 90 cities. There are Achaeans and great-hearted Ediocratans. There are Sidonians and Dorians in 3 divisions, and noble Pelasgians. This excerpt indicates that for Homer, the Pelasgians were part of the complex ethnic landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean, which preceded the final dominance of Greek identity. Furthermore, the Homeric invocation of Pelasgian Zeus at Dodona points to the fact that even the oldest Greek oracles had deep roots in the Pelasgian religious substrate. Thus, Achilles, praying for Patroclus, says, "Zeus, king Dodonaean, Pelasgian, you who live far off, ruling cold Dodona, around whom live the Seloi, your prophets, with unwashed feet, who sleep upon the ground." So it can be said that for Homer, the Pelasgians are not mythical ancestors from the mist of time, but a real, albeit very ancient, people who lived on these lands from time immemorial. He distinguishes them as those who possess old rights to the land and live alongside the new people. The strongest argument in favor of their antiquity is the aforementioned epithet of Zeus, Zeus Pelasgios. In the religious consciousness of the ancient Greeks, Dodona was the oldest place where an oracle lived. By calling the chief god Pelasgian, Homer effectively acknowledges that a religious cult existed in this most ancient place even before the arrival of the Achaeans. That is, the Pelasgians possessed this land and these shrines earlier than the heroes of the Iliad. Hesiod, in his works, develops the genealogical line of the Pelasgians, presenting them as the autochthonous population of Greece. And although most of his works have reached us only in the form of fragments, it is precisely these fragments that allow us to reconstruct how Hesiod built the pedigree of the Pelasgians. Thus, in the poem Catalogue of Women, or Ehoiai, Hesiod makes Pelasgus the forefather of the Arcadians through his son Lycaon. He writes, "Sons were born to godlike Lycon, whom once Pelasgus begot." Here, Hesiod constructs the line, Earth, Pelasgus, Lycaon, the 50 sons of Lycaon. From these sons, according to Hesiod, came the names of many cities of the Peloponnese. By this, he asserts that the entire topography and population of the region descend from a single ancestor, Pelasgus. Hesiod, through the testimony of Apollodorus, established the canon according to which Pelasgus is not simply the name of a chieftain, but a synonym for the first human on Greek soil, from whom local dynasties originated even before the arrival of the Hellenes. Hesiod's version is echoed by Asius of Samos, who believed that Pelasgus was the first human born from the black earth itself on the high peaks of the mountains to give rise to mortal humanity. This emphasizes the concept of the autochthony of the Pelasgians as earthborn. Asius of Samos wrote, "Godlike Pelasgus, the black earth, brought forth on the high-peaked mountains that the race of mortals might exist." This myth of birth from the earth became the basis for the later ideology of Athens, where the inhabitants of Attica prided themselves on their Pelasgian origin, asserting that they had never changed their land, unlike immigrant peoples. Historical thought of the 5th century BC, represented primarily by Herodotus, attempted to systematize the scattered mentions of the Pelasgians into a coherent historical concept. In his fundamental work, The Histories, Herodotus claims that in ancient times, the entire territory of modern Greece was called Pelasgia. Thus, in the second book of his Histories, titled Euterpe, Herodotus tries to give a rational explanation for the legend of the black doves that supposedly flew from Egypt and founded the oracle at Dodona. He assumes that in reality, these were kidnapped priestesses. And he writes, "But I have this opinion concerning the matter. If the Phoenicians did in truth carry away the sacred women and sell one into Libya and one into Hellas, then, in my opinion, the place where this woman was sold in what is now Hellas, but was formerly called Pelasgia, was Thesprotia." He also draws a clear line between two branches of the Greek people, the Dorians, whom he calls Hellenes, who constantly migrated, and the Ionians, who were Pelasgians by origin and remained faithful to their land. In this passage from Book 1, Herodotus describes King Croesus' search for the strongest allies in Greece. He writes, "Croesus learned that the Lacedaemonians and the Athenians were the foremost. These were the most eminent races in ancient time, the second being a Pelasgian, and the first a Hellenic race." However, Herodotus presents researchers with a complex riddle, noting that the Pelasgians spoke a barbarian, that is, non-Greek language. Analyzing the language of the Pelasgians, which survived to his time in Creston and on the Hellespont, he concludes that if all Pelasgians spoke the same way, then the Athenians, having become Hellenes, must have changed their language to Greek. This assertion by Herodotus became the cornerstone for all subsequent linguistic theories about the Pelasgian substrate as a foreign element within the Greek language. Recent achievements in paleogenetics have allowed the discussion about the autochthony of the Pelasgians to be moved into the realm of precise data. Iosif Lazaridis, in his fundamental study, Genetic Origins of the Minoans and Mycenaeans, 2017, analyzed the genomes of ancient inhabitants of the Aegean Basin and established that the Minoans and Mycenaeans derived at least 3/4 of their ancestry from the first Neolithic farmers who arrived from Anatolia about 7,000–8,000 BC. This indicates that the Pelasgians were descendants of this first great wave of migrants, who over thousands of years became the de facto autochthonous substrate of the region. The archaeological equivalent of the Pelasgians, in my opinion, can be considered the Early Helladic II culture. But before we talk about it, let's discuss one nuance. The term Pelasgians was used by the Greeks as a name for all pre-Greek tribes. Therefore, Early Helladic II is undoubtedly Pelasgian, but perhaps not the only Pelasgians, as there were also cultures on the islands, such as on Lemnos. The chronology of the Early Helladic period is based on careful stratigraphic studies of key sites such as Lerna, Karaku, Eutresis, and Tiryns. The generally accepted system divides this period into two main cultural subphases, which reflect the gradual transformation of material culture and architectural styles. The early phase, known as the Koraku culture, 2650–2450 BC, represents a period of the formation of basic Helladic traditions, such as architecture, bureaucracy, and technological tradition. The late phase, 2450–2200 BC, is defined by the appearance of elements of the Lefkandi Kastri culture, which testify to the strengthening influence of Western Anatolia and the northeastern islands of the Aegean Sea. Most vividly, this manifested itself in a change in social rituals and a technological leap. This influence of Western Anatolia materialized primarily in the appearance of a specific Troji set of vessels, particularly refined two-handled cups, tankards, and flat plates, which testified to a new culture of feasting. Moreover, the fast potter's wheel, which allowed for the creation of thin-walled standardized ceramics, began to be massively used for their manufacture. In parallel, a revolution took place in metallurgy, where, thanks to the establishment of trade connections with the East, local arsenical copper began to be displaced by higher-quality tin bronze. And in architecture, this eastern vector is recorded in the construction of new types of fortifications with semicircular towers, as, for example, at the settlement of Kastri on Syros, which directly imitated the fortification traditions of Troy and Lemnos, indicating a possible migration of carriers of this culture, or the close integration of elites. Since we have touched upon architectural traditions, the development of settlements in the period of Early Helladic II demonstrates a transition from simple Neolithic villages to complex formations of an urban character. Settlements were usually located on natural hills, about 30 meters high, or on low elevations near the coast, which facilitated access to maritime trade routes and fertile coastal plains. Most known settlements occupied an area of 1 to 3 hectares. However, some centers, such as Manica and Thebes, significantly exceeded these standards, pointing to the formation of regional hierarchies. During the late stage, the architectural organization of settlements becomes more orderly. Different planning systems are distinguished: dense development in separate blocks divided by narrow paths, linear planning along a central road, and a unique radial system recorded on Aegina, where identical buildings were situated around a common center. However, the most impressive achievement of the period is the appearance of so-called corridor houses, monumental structures that functioned as administrative and economic centers. Thus, a corridor house is a two-story rectangular structure, usually measuring about 25 house 12 meters. There was a stone foundation up to a meter thick and a superstructure of mud brick reinforced with wooden beams. The name itself comes from the narrow corridors located along the long sides of the house, which housed staircases to the second floor. The most famous example is the House of the Tiles in Lerna, named so because of the thousands of fragments of fired clay roof tiles that covered its sloping roof. This technology was revolutionary for its time, as tiled roofs practically disappeared after the Early Helladic II period and became mass-produced in Greece again only in the 6th century BC. The building had a complex internal layout with central rooms, a grand vestibule, and storage rooms, such as Room X, where numerous seal impressions were found. Similar structures, such as the White House on Aegina and the house on the Felsrand, edge of the cliff, confirm the spread of this type of building as symbols of power and economic control. The study of the relative chronology of these buildings allows us to distinguish stages of their development, from elementary forms in Thebes to transitional and mature examples in Lerna and Aegina. In addition to rectangular buildings, the Early Helladic II period is characterized by the use of circular structures. On the upper citadel of Tiryns, a unique structure, the Rundbau, with a diameter of 28 meters, was discovered. It is a colossal construction of concentric walls of mud brick on a stone sokol, which likely functioned as a communal granary or as a citadel. The construction of such an object required the collective efforts of the entire community, so it may indicate a high level of social integration. Similar but smaller round buildings with a diameter of about 3 to 8 meters were also found in Orchomenos and Voidokilia. Evidence of social stratification in the period of Early Helladic II is undeniable. However, the nature of this hierarchy remains a subject of debate. Traditionally, Early Helladic II society is described as a chiefdom, that is, an intermediate stage between Neolithic egalitarianism, and the Mycenaean state structure. The find of 143 clay ceilings in Lerna became key evidence for the existence of an administrative apparatus. Seals were used to mark wooden chests, jars, and sacks, indicating control over the contents of containers. However, recent studies by Maggie Beale suggest reviewing this model. She argues that sealing could have been a form of collective action, a strategy of small communities for mutual monitoring of contributions to communal feasts. In this interpretation, contributions were not private or state property, but instead were a pool of resources available to all feast participants. The design of the seals, which demonstrates over 70 different geometric patterns, could have been the emblem of separate groups or families, rather than the personal signatures of administrators. Thus, the complexity of Early Helladic II society could have been based on cooperation and non-hierarchical dynamics, making it fundamentally different from the later Mycenaean. The religious worldview, which had a pronounced chthonic and animistic character with a focus on the veneration of the productive forces of nature and the great mother goddess, is reconstructed today thanks to a synthesis of ancient testimonies and concrete archaeological finds, primarily thousands of clay figurines from Neolithic settlements like Sesklo and Dimini, and early Helladic layers, which served as household images of fertility long before the appearance of the Olympian pantheon. Unlike the later Greek tradition of depicting gods as ideal humans, the Pelasgian cult was predominantly aniconic, that is, one where the divine essence was honored through sacred stones, beetles, and living trees, which is brilliantly confirmed by excavations at Dodona, where for centuries no stone temples were built around the sacred oak of Pelasgian Zeus, limiting rituals to the open air. The deep connection of this religion with the underworld is also materially recorded in the form of specific sacrificial pits, Bothroi, found in Lerna and Eleusis, where liquid offerings were poured down into the earth rather than burned for celestial gods. Together with the remains of primitive rock altars on Samothrace, this proves the existence of a developed system of mystical rituals, which the Indo-European Greeks later assimilated but could not completely erase. The end of the Early Helladic II period was catastrophic. Most key settlements, including Lerna, Tiryns, Aeson, Zygures, Thebes, and Agios Kosmas, were destroyed by fire or abandoned. The traditional version, supported by John Caskey, linked the destruction to a wave of conquerors, speakers of Indo-European languages who brought with them apsidal houses, tumuli, and gray minyan ware. It was believed that these aggressive newcomers conquered the more developed but peaceful local population. But did these new people destroy the Pelasgians? The lack of simultaneity in the destruction and the discovery of many new elements in previous layers cast doubt on this theory. David Raich, in his work Who We Are and How We Got Here 2018, describes the mass migration of representatives of the Yamnaya culture as a key moment that changed the genetic and linguistic map of Europe, emphasizing that these migrants did not displace the local population completely, but mixed with it. One can also mention A Short History of Humanity by Johannes Krause, where he notes that modern Greeks are largely the genetic descendants of those very ancient Pelasgian farmers, since the Indo-European newcomers, although they brought their language, were a minority in numbers and dissolved into the local population. In the work The Mycenaean Age, a study of the monuments and culture of pre-Homeric Greece, Tsuntas asserts that the construction of the great citadels of Mycenae and Tiryns relied on the architectural traditions of the Pelasgian substrate. And Edward Dodwell, in his work A Classical and Topographical Tour Through Greece, develops the theory that the so-called Cyclopean masonry, characteristic of the walls of Tiryns, is a direct marker of the Pelasgian presence. And the legends about the Cyclopes are merely a later explanation for the engineering mastery of the Pelasgians. However, it should be noted that not all Pelasgians remained in Greece. Ancient historians, particularly Hellanicus and Herodotus, claimed that a part of the Pelasgians, which was displaced by the Hellenes, sailed west to Italy, where they became the ancestors of the Etruscans, or Tyrrhenians. Although modern science treats direct migrations with caution, the linguistic connection between the language of the Pelasgians of Lemnos and the Etruscan language in Italy is considered a proven fact. Yes, both belong to the same Tyrrhenian language family, and this may indicate that the Pelasgians were part of a great Mediterranean world that was severed by the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. So, as we can see, the Pelasgians did not vanish without a trace. They became the maternal foundation for the subsequent Mycenaean civilization, giving it the land, the names of cities, goddesses, the art of stoneworking, and a significant part of the genetic code, whereas the Indo-Europeans gave the language, the patriarchal structure, and the warrior culture. Summing up, modern science, thanks to paleogenetics, confirms that the Pelasgians were not a mythical construct, but a real population that laid the foundation of European civilization. The genetic studies of Lazaridis and Reich demonstrate that the Pelasgian substrate was autochthonous, in the sense that it represented the first masters of this land, whose blood still flows in the veins of the inhabitants of modern Hellas. Friends, thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. Good night and good luck.